concentrating wealth. And to be clear about what we're talking about, I've just sort of put these two equations up here. The top equation is just exchanging goods for money, and sometimes people think that this is what capitalism is, but this is not capitalism. The upper one is where I have a commodity, I have some potatoes, I sell them and make some money, and then I go and buy some clothes, which C is another commodity, M is money. So I go home with my clothes, somebody else goes home with their potatoes, and we're done. That's not capitalism. The bottom one is the equation for capital, where I have some money, I buy a commodity, I buy a whole lot of potatoes from an industrial grower, and I sell it for more money. I've increased the value of my investment, and we have that M prime. And the two things to note about this equation is that, of course, this bottom one, there's no end point. It's just continually expanding, pursuing, monetary expansion infinitely into the future, constantly growing. And the other thing to note about it is that this M that I had at the outset was surplus wealth. So I had already paid for my own food and housing and whatnot, and I had this surplus to invest in those potatoes. I already had a share of the surplus wealth of my society, and this equation allows me, I throw it into the capital relation, and lo and behold, it's grown. And I now have more of the surplus wealth of my society. And so we can see this, if this is allowed to happen unchecked, we get into the kinds of levels of social inequality that we have today. So looking at this is a mechanism for the concentration of wealth and social power, and it has received an ideal stimulus in the form of fossil fuels. That as a concentrated form of energy, fossil fuels allow capital to tick over faster. And intercapitalist competition dictates that each business is trying to turn over its capital faster than its competitors. So what happens is that whoever, over the last 2 centuries, whoever has been able to incorporate more coal and then oil, gas, into their operations by automating labor and replacing expensive labor force, by accelerating transportation, by accelerating the growth of crops with petrochemical fertilizers, etc. Whoever adds more fossil fuels turns over their capital faster. So if you sort of imagine that investment surges to wherever capital turns over faster, and whoever more effectively incorporates fossil fuels turns over their capital more rapidly, investment is like the foot on the gas tank, driving the extraction of more and more fossil fuels and driving the greater and greater incorporation of these materials into every aspect of our lives. So there's this acceleration and expansion that also comes with a great deal of disposability. I'm just going to switch to this slide for a minute. So to turn over capital in this expansive way, you want to have your goods not last. You want them to die faster. You want the cell phone to break, the laptop to break, the car to break. Somebody needs to buy a new one. The faster that consumer demand can be grown, the better. So you have this whole culture of disposable goods. And fossil fuels have not only fueled that process as a fuel, but also as this feedstock for the petrochemical industry, for plastics. And we need to think of those alongside one another, that they're both fueling this rapid turnover. And of course, there's many things that are tragic about this, but when that acceleration happens, that is so valued in turning over capital quickly, it accelerates death as well for many. Mortality starts to tick up. And we're seeing that most dramatically with climate change, but it's also, of course, true of petrochemical pollution, plastic debris in the ocean. Our picture here, the sea turtle is mistaking the plastic bag for a jellyfish. And this is going to potentially be fatal for the sea turtle. So there's all this mortality, quickened, premature mortality embedded in our relationship with fossil fuels. There's the quickened mortality of the goods that are made from plastics and petrochemicals that are designed to break. And there's the quickened mortality for those who are going to ingest, inhale, drink the toxic byproducts of this process. Andrew Pendakis, who's a scholar, looks at oil. He says, oil is not just time, it is death. It is the energy made possible by eons of concrete dying. So that's what it is. There's all these generations of plants, animals, and their deaths are under pressure under the earth. And that death compresses. And when it's brought to the surface, it works so well as a fuel because you burn generations of organic matter in every barrel of oil. Another scholar did the math and said that we now burn, on average, in our consumption of fossil fuels, 400 years of the planet's entire biomass. So the equivalent of 400 years of the planet's entire biomass is burned every year. And that's the degree of acceleration of life that's going on under petrocapitalism. So the gas tank is being driven by investment, and fossil fuels are driving this overall planetary acceleration of death. And as I was getting into my research on this, I was looking a lot at toxicology, at the effects of petrochemicals. And this term kept coming up, hydrophobia. And hydrophobia is a chemical property that characterizes coal, oil, and gas when they come out of the ground. And it means water hating. And in chemical terms, it just means that those substances are averse to water. They don't bond with water molecules. And we all know this about oil, that it avoids water. And that's why when petrochemicals end up in our bodies, they adhere to our fats. And we get these cancers of the breast, prostate, the bone marrow, because they're attracted to fats and they lodge there. So that's the chemical property of hydrophobia, and there's nothing unnatural or unique about hydrophobia. The cuticle on top of a lotus leaf is hydrophobic, and that's why the water beads up and rolls off. There are all kinds of natural things that are hydrophobic. But it was interesting to me as a term that these are water-hating substances, and that our economies and our everyday lives are built from all of these water-hating substances. And I started to think about the relationship between capital and fossil fuels and water with that in mind. That every stage and form, you know, the picture of the BP oil spill cleanup here, every stage and form of our engagement with fossil fuels has degraded and depleted water, and diminished water's capacity to sustain life. And the second thing that occurred to me as I got more deeply into this, so A, we've got, you know, just the plain chemical property, fossil fuels averse to water. B, we've got this damage being done to water systematically the more we engage with fossil fuels. And finally, it occurred to me that this term, water hating, was perfect to describe this antagonism between capitalism and water as well. That the logics of capital, and I don't have time to get into this into any depth tonight, but just to kind of throw it out there, that the logics of capital run directly counter to the logics of water. And the first thing to note about that we've already seen is that capital is about concentration, concentrates wealth, and feeds on this concentrated time, concentrated energy, where water is constantly this force of diffusion, that anything that falls into water gets diluted and spreads. If I move my arm through the water, that influence is going to carry out as widely as possible. That it's constantly diffusing influences, in contrast to the synergy between oil and capital that is based on concentration. We'll get more into that as we go along, but I just wanted to flag that at the outset and think about LNG and fracking in terms of this water-hating system of social life we're living in. Okay, so water impacts of fracking. This is a quote from an elder from the West Moberly First Nation, talking about what he's experiencing with the shale gas industry as it currently stands. So water gets pumped from local lakes and rivers for use in the fracking process. And each fracking well, I've got these handouts here if anyone wants at the end to take home some of these numbers with them. Each fracking well requires between 15 million and 100 million liters of water. So what they do is they go around in these trucks. This is a truck dumping wastewater, but the trucks that look like this stick their hoses into the Peace River, the lakes and other rivers of that region, beaver ponds, anywhere they can find surface water. They siphon the water up into their trucks. A typical Horn River fracking job requires 2,300 truckloads of water. And within 1 to 4 weeks following the frack job, so all this water, chemicals, and sand are pumped in at high pressure into these wells, 30% of the water comes back up. So a lot of it's left down there with all of its chemicals and whatnot. They call this water flowback, and they'll deal with that if a regulator is watching. So they will, they'll take that water and they'll put it into a holding pit like this. Chemicals can migrate from a frack well into adjacent aquifers. These have leaked. Those chemicals have shown up in the Peace River already, and this industry hasn't even been going on for very long. And already wells and streams in the area have been drying up. Lakes have been drying up. And Treaty 8 First Nations, there's been a number of court cases about individual sites where they'll take an individual company to court at great expense to find out that yes, this company violated its water permits. Of that 15 million to 100 million liters of water used in each fracking well, upwards of 114,000 liters can be chemical additives. And for the longest time, the fracking companies weren't revealing the contents of these fracking chemicals because they were saying it was proprietary and they couldn't tell us. Finally, they've been forced to tell us what's in there, and researchers are starting to look at it. So there are about 1,117 chemicals that have been disclosed. And there's only data on the human health effects of 20% of them. So we really have no idea what these things are doing. But epidemiology has shown that in the areas around fracking sites, there are higher levels of acute childhood leukemia, other cancers, congenital heart defects in children, asthma, miscarriages, migraines, and fatigue. And hospitalization rates are significantly higher in regions surrounding fracking industries. The Peace River region already, as a host to this shale gas industry, has higher than normal cancer rates. When the water flows back, it has all those chemicals that have been added, but it also has heavy metals, arsenic, barium, cadmium, lithium, and lead, among others. And then also the oil and gas itself contaminates the water, including often radioactive materials that are found underwater, so the fracking underground, so the fracking fluid that flows back can sometimes be radioactive. And what happens then, so this water that comes up in the first 1 to 4 weeks gets dealt with, but water continues to leak out of the well, because it's only been 30% of the water that's come up. The rest continues to leak from the well for decades. So as we're looking at this, I just want to sort of start a little tally in our minds. It's not going to be a precise tally, but how many premature mortalities are associated with this industry. So for each of these fracking wells, with all of those heavy metals, all of those contaminants, all of those additional cancers and hospitalizations, How many people are dying early because of this? And how many deaths per job might be a question to ask when they tout how many jobs are being produced. So besides water, other sources of illness and mortality, air contamination, earthquakes are generated by fracking. And here we have the caribou of that region, which are endangered. And people who are observing these things are saying that those caribou will not survive an expansion of the shale gas industry. Like that industry has to stop if that endangered population. Some of the populations up there have lost over 84% of their numbers since the 80s. So they're still there. It's still possible to bring that back. And when we think about the treaty commitments, there's a millennial relationship between the Cree, Dene, and Denizat people and the caribou. Other sources of premature mortality. They like to talk about how LNG is way safer to transport than oil because there's no spills. It's a vapor. If this tanker were to breach, it just dissipates into the air. Right, so it dissipates into the air as a vapor cloud. And if there's any spark that it encounters as it dissipates as a vapor cloud, that vapor cloud will turn into an explosion. And the area of danger around an LNG tanker is 3.5 kilometers. That if there were a hull breach in Howe Sound, as it's leaving wood fiber LNG in Squamish, anything within 3.5 kilometers could be incinerated. That includes where my mother lives in the Sea to Sky corridor. Yeah. Okay, so these are risks that don't get talked about in our public discussions about this. Another one is man camps. Research on these influxes of temporary workers to produce the pipelines and also just to do the fracking itself. There's a strong correlation in research between man camps and gendered violence. So when we look at the whole issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, this is a recipe for more of that going on. And researchers who look at this just say this is what happens. You can look at the quotation from that researcher there. This is a quote that I find really powerful from Leanne Simpson, who's an Anishinaabe thinker. And she writes that colonialism and capitalism are based on extracting and assimilating. My land is seen as a resource. My relatives in the plant and animal worlds are seen as resources. My culture and knowledge is a resource. The act of extraction removes all of the relationships that give whatever is being extracted meaning. The alternative is deep reciprocity. So,
what does the final word mean?
Reciprocity means that we share back and forth. We give and we take, as opposed to me just taking from you and giving nothing in return.
Constant exchange. Just like,
yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be direct, like you give me an apple and I give you an apple. It can be that we all kind of exchange as a flow, exactly. So there are a number of things about this quote from her that I find powerful. One of them kind of harkens back to what I was saying about capitalism as a mode of accumulation and concentration of wealth. That in order to concentrate wealth, you have to continually take more than you give back. And this intercapitalist competition mandates that I not give back. Because if I'm an agriculturalist and I am taking the time to return organic matter carefully into my soil and hiring people to do that, of course my product is going to be more expensive, my profit margins are going to be less, and I'm going to be out of business. And so as much as there are human impulses toward reciprocity, which there certainly are, they are continuously stifled by the forces of intercapitalist competition. So as long as we have that intercapitalist competition driving our societies, we're not going to be able to initiate reciprocal relationships with each other and with the land on a systematic basis. People resist that all the time. They manage to be reciprocal, but they're doing that in the margins. They're not able to do it as the full force of what they're doing. So we have to get rid of that extractive character of our relations. The other thing that's interesting about this to me is that when we think about extractivism, this practice of taking more than is returned, it's modeled on mining, that mining is a sort of quintessential human activity. We take something out of the ground, that we don't give anything back. Anything else like agriculture, fishing, forestry can all be done in a reciprocal way, where we feed the soil, we take care of the salmon habitat, we take care of the forest. Mining is one way. And so it's sort of interesting to me in this dynamic between fossil fuels and capitalism that there's a synergy there, that this substance that our economies are based on requires extraction. And then everything else, our agriculture, our forestry, our fisheries, our labor relations, all take on this extractive character. And so that's one of the things that we need to address when we think about getting beyond fossil fuels. We need to also get beyond extractivism. The other thing is that what she's talking about, this process of extraction and colonialism severs relationships. And the word fracking and hydraulic fracturing is really evocative of that in the process you're fracturing relationships. I was looking before at the caribou, that relationship between the people living in that region and the caribou gets fractured by this development. But the same with all of these other relations, with the moose, the beaver, the fish. I didn't mention before that these animals actually preferentially come to drink out of the toxic holding ponds because a lot of salt comes up with all this other stuff from underground, and they treat it as a mineral lick. They're attracted by the salt. So moose, elk, deer, bear come and drink out of the holding ponds. And hunters have been finding moose with abscesses on their internal organs. The water in the region has been so contaminated that when elders go into the bush to do their traditional activities, they bring bottled water now because they used to be able to dip their cup in the lake, and now they have to drink bottled water. So the relationships between the people and the animals, between the animals and the landscape get fractured in the process of hydraulic fracturing. The other thing about this elder's comments, unfortunately, in the document where I found it, his name wasn't given, or her name, but he or she says the river is not just the water, it's the vegetation, the fish, the medicines, the moose that come down to drink. The water is held by its relations, that water sustains all of these living beings, but it also is sustained by them. The water doesn't exist in a vacuum. Water is held by vegetation, it's held by the presence of animals. And people, when human beings are behaving in an ecologically beneficial way, we're part of that, holding the water and providing a relational home for it in the land. So this is an important thing when I was talking about hydrophobia and about the logics, the sort of water-hating logic of capitalism, that that logic of fracturing relationships is opposed by the logic of water, which is a logic of interconnection and interrelation. Water is always connecting us to other animals, to plants, to each other. And now we get into the climate impacts. And again, as a water scholar, I think of climate change as a water issue. And I actually would put a pitch in for thinking about it that way, that a lot of the ways that we talk about climate change get very abstract because it's about parts per million in the atmosphere. It's important for us all to be literate about that stuff, but it tends to feel very distant. 1.5 degrees warming, 350 parts per million of carbon. But the major effects of climate change are on water, on our relationship with the hydrosphere. we have things like, people dying of heat stroke from the rising temperatures, that exists, but glacier loss, I don't know if you can see in this picture, but it's looking at all of the major rivers that are going to be affected as we lose the Himalayan glaciers. These are the water sources and the irrigation water, drinking and irrigation for 1.3 billion people. The Ganges, the Indus, the Mekong, the Yangtze, the Yellow. There are 7 of the major rivers on the planet that are fed by the Himalayan glaciers. So as we lose the glaciers to climate change, that water dries up. This is true anywhere there are glaciers and where people rely on glacier runoff, which includes North America with the Rockies. Many of our major North American rivers come from the Rockies, the Andes. And then we look at what climate change does. The most damaging effects often have to do with flooding and drought. That what's happening is that water is appearing all in one place and then not at all in others. We're having more intense storms dropping masses of precipitation that cause flooding and inundation, destruction from the ferocity of the storms. And then we have these prolonged droughts, forest fires, wildfires. And one of the things that has fascinated me as I'm looking at this intersection of fossil fuels, water, and capital is that this mirrors what's going on with the concentration of wealth. It's as though the water is just sort of responding to the concentration of wealth on the planet. That Oxfam said that in 2017, 82% of the total global production of wealth went into the bank accounts of the wealthiest 1%. And if you've been following those statistics, they get more ridiculous every couple of years. Like, it's just happening so fast, this sort of runaway concentration of wealth. And we think of water as a form of wealth. This is also happening, and it's pathological. When there's that much wealth in one place, it is toxic. Wealth is great, but when it's concentrated, it's toxic. When water is concentrated like this, it's deadly. Okay, so I don't really like text on slides, but these are a lot of statistics here. Without producing LNG for export, with these new terminals that want to be constructed, there's already 12 million tons of CO2 produced by this industry in BC annually. And you look at where BC wants to be by 2050, the bottom one here, we want to be at 13 million tons. These two projects together would produce an additional annual amount of CO2 of 10 to 13.5 million tons. So right there you can see, like, maybe if we got to net zero by 2050 in the whole rest of the province, we could meet those targets. Unfortunately, I don't know if I wrote this on a slide. No, I didn't. But unfortunately, those BC targets are not high enough to actually get us to stay at 1.5 degrees of warming and avoid catastrophic degrees of climate change. So the International Panel on Climate Change this year was looking at the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming, and the kind of reductions that would need to happen to keep us below 2 degrees. Because 2 degrees is where things get pretty extreme, and we get these potentially runaway climate change scenarios happening. So the BC emissions targets don't get us there. They're not ambitious enough, and even with these weak emissions targets, this LNG export industry would throw us over the edge. But it gets a little bit worse, actually, because this is counting CO2 emissions. These are the numbers that the province has tallied up. But they don't include methane emissions. And methane, over a 20-year time horizon, is 86 to 105 times more potent in its atmospheric warming effects than CO2. And what they like to do in the natural gas industry is they look at a 100-year time horizon, because methane kind of breaks down in the atmosphere after 20 years. So over a 100-year time horizon, it looks a little bit better. But 20 years is really important in terms of what's happening with our global climate. And so for this kind of intensity of greenhouse gas effect to happen is not something I want to see. So when methane emissions are taken into account, natural gas is between 20% worse than coal and twice as bad as coal. So best case scenario, it's 20% worse than coal in its greenhouse gas effects. The methane is released in the fracking process, it's released during transport in the pipelines, and it's released from the liquefied natural gas terminals during that cooling process. So this is kind of a deal breaker, if we hadn't already had a deal breaker. So constructing these terminals makes it impossible for BC to meet its climate targets, and we're into way overshoot of those climate targets given these methane emissions.
Do you have any good news?
Yeah, I do. People always leave the good news for last. I could have led with it, but I do. I know this is super dismal. And I'm gonna like get even more dismal on you. That because I wanted us to sort of be making this tally of fatalities, like how many deaths per job. If they're touting that there are 10,000 new jobs that are going to be created from this industry, how many deaths per job? In that IPCC report, they talk about if business as usual continues, that by 2030, this is only 12 years from now, they're expecting about 6 million deaths per year from climate change. So we've already seen these wildfires, hurricanes of great intensity, droughts, like there's going to be food insecurity, epidemics, etc. So they're estimating about 6 million a year, and that's the equivalent of the Holocaust every year. People who are looking at this are starting to say that we should be trying fossil fuel executives for crimes against humanity. That it's not genocide because they're not targeting any particular ethnic group or religious sect, but that it's a crime against humanity. It's very hard to, climate change is so distant, it's hard to actually metabolize this sort of thing, but with this basically, greenhouse gas bomb sitting in our backyard, there are a lot of lives at stake in our responsibility to stop this. Okay, a little bit more bad news. Gonna keep going in the darkness here. I just want us to put in the same frame. Again, this is with my thinking of water as the frame for this. And again, water being the substance of life. That we have all of these disturbances in the planetary hydrology from, and I didn't even mention them all, ocean acidification, for example, just enormous, sea level rise. We should also be thinking about plastic pollution and petrochemical contamination. The LNG industry is a feedstock. When it goes to Asia, it's not just getting burned, it's getting turned into petrochemicals, it's getting turned into plastics, it's getting turned into petrochemical fertilizers. So here's a dead zone, algae overgrowth, that took up all the oxygen in the water downstream from an industrial farm, which kills all the fish because they suffocate. You've probably seen this. But massive dead zones in lakes, rivers, and ocean basins from industrial agriculture. And again, this is about this dynamic of concentration. Nutrients are one of the forms of wealth on the planet. And nutrients are also concentrated by capital-intensive forms of agriculture, by these massive feedlots with all of the manure and hog waste outside of them, and then by industrial use of fertilizers on farms. So these effects on water, these reductions in the life-giving capacity of water, are happening all simultaneously from our relationship with fossil fuels. Okay, so now we get into the good news. This is Janine MacLeod, late Cree elder. He's not the only one to say this. Water was our first medicine. And so thinking about, when I talked about us living in a hydrophobic social order, a water-hating social order, I think that water can be turned into a medicine for our predicament. That, first of all, our shared love of water, this is an easy place for people to connect. People are already connecting on these grounds, that we all share water, as much as we disagree on other things. And if we can recognize that our current social order is destroying this substance of life that we share, that's a pretty powerful form of solidarity. But also that the logics of water are running precisely counter to the logics of capital. That it is this medium of diffusion, as I said, so it's modeling a diffusion of wealth, of nutrients, of social power, of democratization. It's this medium of connectivity, so it's showing us, if we're looking at water and paying attention to it, it's showing us how we rely on one another as various species and various peoples. And finally, that water is productive of diversity and uniqueness, that wherever it goes, it's facilitating unique forms of life. And so these are, I think, really powerful models for our social movements. And the question becomes not only how to get off the whale and how to say no to capitalism and no to racial injustice and all these other things, but how to create a water-loving social order, and a social order that is going to heal the planetary hydrology. This is horse logging. And I throw this up here to kind of, horse logging is where you can go in, you don't have to build logging roads and whatnot. You can go into the forest, select a tree, and hopefully on the basis of what's going to be good for the forest, you look at trees that are competing with one another, and you haul that tree out with a horse or with a tractor. People do this with a tractor. But it means that you don't cut the whole forest down and lose all that topsoil and all those nice fungal networks underground. The forest and habitat remain intact. And this is very labor intensive. So the point I want to make with this photo, and also with the photo that follows of a small biodiverse farm, is that these reciprocal ways of behaving, these systems of reciprocity that are going to be ecologically regenerative, also are very labor intensive. So these arguments that pit jobs against the environment, there's a lot more employment in these modes of life. And you can't feed investors with this, but you can feed communities and families. So as soon as we jettison this imperative to always be giving returns to investors, we can start to think about these forms as realistic economic activities. They don't look like realistic economic activities if there's that litmus always of, can you provide returns for investors? Really none of the things pretty much that we need to do to heal the planet provide returns for investors, I would argue. Maybe a few, but yes. So I just want to make sure everybody knows before we move into the next section of our evening about Unistoten Camp. Raise hands if you've heard about this. Good. Okay, so they are this is the Wet'suwet'en Nation. The whole hereditary leadership of the Wet'suwet'en Nation has said no to fracked gas pipelines crossing their territory. And the Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation in particular has, for the last 6 years, been building this healing center in the path that the pipelines have to cross. And they're there to say no to the companies. A number of different pipelines have tried to come in, and the Unistoten have been able to stop them. Right now they're struggling to stop this CGL pipeline that would be feeding the LNG terminal in Kitimat. They need lots of help. So this is an avenue for action for sure. And what's beautiful about this is that the healing center that they've built is for members of their community to heal from trauma, from addiction, and to connect with their culture, to be able to hunt and trap and gather medicines on the land. It's a beautiful place. You can still drink out of this river that's in the picture. The more River. You can dip a cup in the Maurice River. It's turquoise and it's delicious. So there's some people to support. And then I also wanted to flag that this exists. Has everybody heard about the Green New Deal? Can you raise your hand if you have? Yeah, so the Green New Deal is being pushed in the US as a way to provide government stimulus to the transition off of fossil fuels, and to do it in a way that generates employment and is in line with principles of social justice. And so there's a whole movement to get one going in Canada as well. And organizations like 350.org and The Leap are really pushing this. And it's at a stage where they want to get everyone involved in having input into what this looks like. Like if we're gonna have a big government stimulus, come on in. If we're gonna have a big government stimulus package to get off of fossil fuels, what should it do? What should it look like? And they're talking about having this be really, front and center about decolonization and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and tying together social struggles. So the struggles for decent housing, for justice for migrants. That of course this connects with climate change, that people are displaced by climate change, among other things, and come here in distress. So settlement of people who are coming here from difficult circumstances, that tying together all these struggles is essential to what the Green New Deal could be. So yeah, if you look at 350.org, they have a place you can sign up to get all the mailing about it and to be part of it. And this is just my little list of what we can do. My Sea to Sky is calling for a fracking ban in BC. So I'm gung-ho to support that. As I was saying, supporting the Unistoten camp, taking part in the Green New Deal, taking part in our local grassroots groups, and John has this other campaign that he wants to tell us about. So what we're going to do, he's going to tell us about this campaign, and then I'll open it out to a Q&A for a few minutes. But then I want to save time for us all to talk about what we envision for this community and beyond in getting off of fossil fuels, and also what's to be done about this LNG mess in the north. So yeah.
I really don't know what to say. I mean, this is probably one of the most profound presentations, and inspiring too, I ever heard about climate change. They really give us an idea what we're dealing with is instrumental and it's urgent. And I think you have given us a really in-depth look at what is involved with this emerging LNG industry in British Columbia. The investment alone that you mentioned, 40-some billion, is actually greater than the project in the tar sand in Alberta. In terms of construction-wise, I read, it's actually greater, have a larger footprint than the tar sand. So we are dealing with a serious issue, both unspoiled coasts as well as climate change our river. We felt that we have to take action. We can't just give public presentation and say we have good public education and walk away, because really education is not education unless those new found knowledge could translate into some kind of meaningful action. So one of our last organizer meeting, we don't have a board yet, but our organizing group felt that one of the actions that we should support is a legal case, a legal challenge that is taken on by a man up in Smithton, BC. In fact, he's a close friend of mine. I know him for over 20-some years. The infamous Michael, well, I just call him Mike Sawyer. This man is the man that single-handedly took on Goliath, like the National Energy Board, Petronas, and forced them to face constitutional law, and won single-handedly. And that was a few years ago. That's a real shocker. And within weeks, Petronas have withdrawn their LNG project going to Prince Rupert, to Lulu Island. It was a massive project. currently, the same man, Michael Sawyer, is embarking on 2 sub-legal battles. One against PNG Canada, which is a massive, massive project going out to Kitimat. And the other one is the Coastal Gas Link, LNG gas line, that just in recent month, about a month ago, the government authorized the militarized RCMP to invade and barge on the gate, their little defender gate on the bridge there, try to prevent the gas line company, Coastal Gas Line, to come in to conduct work after they have informed that they do not have consent to come into their unceded territory. And the Supreme Court of Canada back in 1987, I believe, have ruled that this is unceded territory. And the rightful person to negotiate for any government or company is not the Bank Council leader that was created by the Indian Act, artificially created by the colonial government, but the rightful title holder, which is the territory chief. That ruling was cleared by the Supreme Court of Canada. They just failed to describe role of responsibility in how they conduct their affair yet. But the government has said, we just don't give a damn regardless of what the Supreme Court ruling is. We're just going to send a tribune barge through, which they did. So the project we want to support right now is the one that Michael Sawyer have taken on. He is basically saying, well, first of all, this man had tremendous amount of experience. He got over 25 years of professional experience in environmental consulting and advocacy. He has gained the reputation of technically and legally sound and astute, and also have gained this reputation of being a taxes critic of the oil and gas company. So the current project is that you want to demand this project face proper channel under a constitutional law in how to assess the environmental assessment of the project proposal. The project is approved by provincial government in BC, which has much lower environmental standards for environmental assessment. But this project is clearly intended to build a section first in BC, and then you have existing hundreds and thousands of pipelines in Alberta, and it only take a short distance to make the connection. And the project, he is pretty certain he can demonstrate, the challenge case to demonstrate they have full intention to connect those pipelines, which make it interprovincial. With the interprovincial pipeline, they have to go through a federal process under NEB, the National Energy Board, which have a much higher standard for environmental assessment, despite the fact that Trudeau have assumed the same watered down, gutted down environmental process by Harper. He promised to restore them, he did, but still that watered down process is much stronger than the provincial process. So Michael Sawyer is going to already took them to court, and because it's based on the past precedent of the previous victory, we felt that he had a very good case to win, on top of the evidence that he has that he can demonstrate. But the victory is not going to be will not happen without public support, because he's asking to raise about at least $25,000 out of his own pocket, and he has lawyer friends, environmental lawyer friends, helping him to do it at a huge discount. So they also have expense. Anyway, he cannot do it on his own without public financial support. So that's why we are passing the box along, that if you do incline to support this legal case, to stop the project, because you will require that we do the whole environmental assessment application, which will take quite at least a year or more, with a much higher standard imposed. And not that will only discourage an investor might be pulling out, which happened in the first case when he won. Petronas did pull out 2 weeks after his court victory ruling. They pull out. So same could happen here, because we need the investor and the company will have to spend more money and have huge delay over costs as well. But more importantly, if he didn't win the case, if he just delayed it for another year and a half, that would buy enough time for the restorative legal case to initiate and take root. because they certainly have an argument there on legal ground for indigenous right and title for the sea-like type indigenous title they have. And it's been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in the past, so they have a good chance to do it. But they will require to take some time to raise the fund and get the court initiated. But my project is already rolling. It already filed the application to the Court of Appeal almost more than half a year ago. So in his case, it's already been rolling, but he has to have some financial support to continue and to see it to fruition. So if you feel inclined to support this legal challenge, I will pass the box around, and once this has passed around, I'll ask Janine to come back and do a group discussion.
I also just, if anyone wants, I made these fact sheets about fracking and LNG, so I'll just circulate this. You can take one if you'd like. And it has all of the associated websites for all of these things as well on there. So we'll just take a few minutes. If anyone has any questions about the presentation before we get into the discussion component of the evening. Yes?
I've got a couple of things.
Yeah, great.
One thing, I've got a book called, that I got in the 70s. It's called Time Bomb LNG.
Oh, wow.
And it's an amazing book. But one of the things it talks about is like, in the States, there are no LNG like terminals on the West Coast.
Okay.
It was completely banned. And one of the things they talk about, I mean, it goes on, it's not a very big book. But one thing that you said, 3.5 kilometers, they didn't say that. They said because of the coldness of that, if you have a breach in one of those ships, it can go for 30 miles before it gets to a concentration where it can be lit up.
Right.
And it will go all the way back to that ship or where it breaches.
Okay.
So that's a little bit scary.
So that is a little bit scary.
Yeah.
But the 3 kilometers is already really scary.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
30 miles is a whole different story.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, it's very easy to contribute to UNESCO camp.
Yes.
And I learned about the whole thing because I went to the Cook Island Festival last September, and Frida Lisa was there and talked about it. And it was the same week that our premier went up there and got with the chiefs up there and said, basically he said that we really don't care what your legal rights are, we're coming through.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
Yeah, that situation up there is just
Yeah.
brutal.
And free-
Thanks, John, for kind of running through that because they're.
Frida uses it as a really neat way.
Mhm.
Amazing way.
That's accurate information. I heard that they were trucking sand from USA.
Yes.
Is that true?
I had about 3 hours of material I wanted to share with you, and I knew that I had an hour, and that was one of the things that I can't talk about the sand. But yes, there isn't enough of the right kind of sand in northeastern BC to do the fracking. So they actually, this is part of the greenhouse gas footprint, is that they have to ship sand from the United States in massive quantities to use in the fracking process.
Trucking and fuel.
I have a comment regarding the use of plastics.
Yeah.
All the big grocery stores in this town are still bringing in plastic bags that are paying for the bags, but also advertising the stores. So it should be that the CEOs of these stores should just say, bring them in.
Right.
Obviously, we